everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Innovative State Legislative Approaches, Addressing a Challenging Environment, hosted by Rails to Trails Conservancy. My name is Iman Sylvain, and I'm the Western Regional Director for RTC, and I'll be serving as your moderator for today's session. During the webinar, RTC policy staff and featured guests will discuss best practices for building a state legislative agenda focused on achieving policy wins and funding active transportation. The session will touch on legislative basics and timelines before diving into how to address new funding challenges with creative approaches to creating and defending funding for sources of walking, biking, and trails. Today, I am joined by my colleague and RTC's Director of State Level Policy, Drew Dupuis, and we are both thrilled to welcome Lily Bostrom, Senior Environmental Planner at Ascent in California, and Luke Hoffman, Executive Director of the Iowa Bicycle Coalition, to learn more about state policies that exempt trails from regulatory burdens and how to oppose state funding cuts to trails, as well as additional innovative approaches to state-level trail decisions. With that, I'll hand it over to Drew for opening slides.
Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are in the country. I'm Drew Dupuis. I'm the Director of State Level Policy for Rails to Trails Conservancy, and I work with state legislatures and state agencies around the country to help advocate for more funding for biking and walking infrastructure and trails around the country. So we do this state policy webinar about this time of year every year to help advocates in states around the country prepare for legislative sessions. Most states have a part-time legislature. Most states convene around January or February and go until April or May, although some are longer term than that and some are shorter. So we feel that this is a good time to get everybody thinking about legislative sessions, make sure that you have your legislative agenda developed so that you're ready to go when the filing period starts or when session kicks in. And so we do encourage people to really think about that. And if you have questions about how to do that, feel free to reach out to me. My contacts will be at the end. What's different this year is I think that we're facing a different and more challenging political and fiscal environment than we've seen in a long time. Federal funding cuts have put a lot of pressure on some very essential services at the state level, which therefore makes biking, walking, and trail infrastructure sometimes a lower priority because of bigger gaps to fill. You additionally have declining revenue forecasts within states, meaning there's less money to play with. And so whereas we normally talk about being kind of on offense and proactive about seeking new dedicated recurring funding or just new funding for biking, walking, and trails, I think we're going to be in an environment of playing a lot of defense and wanting to anticipate that there may be cuts to programs. And this is not just in red states. We've seen this in blue states and purple states as well. So you want to kind of get out ahead of these things, sort of inoculate against some of them, like let your legislators and key committee members know that trails and biking, walking infrastructure is important to you before the cuts come down. And our first guest, Luke, will be talking about a particular case of a defensive victory. And then, of course, the other facet is that there's a political environment that's changed a lot. A lot of it's coming down from the federal level, but it really is playing out in a lot of states. And it's going to be a situation that's increasingly partisan, and I think not going to be the most friendly to funding these kinds of things. So what we will do after Luke's presentation, Lily's presentation, and some other things I'm talking about at the end, will get into some policy models that might be more politically attainable in this fiscal and political environment, and that, generally speaking, have less of a cost, less of a fiscal note, and therefore might be a little more palatable in these difficult times. So with that, I'll kick it over to Luke Hoffman, the Executive Director of the Iowa Bicycling Coalition, who's going to talk about one of these defensive strategies.
Great. Thank you so much, Drew, and to the entire RTC team for facilitating this webinar and conversation. I'm really excited to talk to everybody today. Luke Hoffman, Executive Director, Iowa Bike Coalition. I just hit 2 years in my role here in October, and we've really hit the ground running with a number of different things, including a really robust leaning into our legislative strategy, which is very much our bread and butter here. And so I'm happy to talk about some of that today. A couple of different layers that we'll be talking about, both the defensive tactic and strategies around that, some offensive plays that folks can hopefully replicate in other areas. And then doing some of that, getting out ahead of things in inoculation that Drew referenced. So let's go ahead and next slide and get into it. So the first component of this is going to be our economic impact of cycling and trail study. This is the forward-facing marketing materials that we use to roll out the renewal of a study that we did back originally in 2012, which showed that the statewide impact of recreational cycling in Iowa was 364.9 million. This was back in 2012, over 10 years ago when I had started. And a lot has changed, whether it be the pandemic or inflation, the number of trails in Iowa, all sorts of different things. And the exciting thing that we were able to do here, the opportunity was we were able to build out an even more robust study. And so in thinking about, setting the stage ahead of time so that you can, like to Drew's point, inoculate, especially policymakers and legislative leaders against preemptively putting trails on the chopping block. Because as we had here in Iowa, we knew there was going to be a looming budget deficit. And right now it stands and is increasing every day at about 8 billion. So it is, no small matter here. And we have some great funding here in Iowa. If you want to go to the next slide. The funding environment is really robust. You can see here from the list of partners that we have a lot of support for trails. This here is the list of partners who help sponsor this study. So we used it as a public engagement opportunity. I couldn't fit all the logos on the slide, but you get the idea here. Everything from my bike club. Here's the Tall Dog Bike Club. They gave $500 towards the overall study sponsorship goal. We wanted to raise about $40,000. It was a $40,000 endeavor. That 2012 study, by the way, was about a $4,000 endeavor. So it was leagues ahead of where we were back in 2012. And we really wanted to go, all out for this thing and just showcase the breadth and depth of support for trails in Iowa, whether that be at the government level, the local government level, the state government level, quasi-governmental, nonprofit organizations, trail associations, bike clubs, bike-friendly businesses, what I call the big bike family, or otherwise the ecosystem of cycling and trails in Iowa that exists, and we wanted to tap into that. So if you want to go next slide, the key takeaway is that 364.9 million now today it stands at 1.4 billion every year for Iowa's economy. A very eye-catching number. We really leaned into the earned media aspect of this, got a lot of press attention to make sure that we are just totally permeating the public sphere and the narrative, getting a lot of press attention, to feature story written in the Des Moines Register about this, our biggest statewide paper. 1 in 3 Iowans ride a bike, 900,000 annual riders. And so whether that's folks who ride a couple times a year, a couple times a month, or 3 to 5 times per week if you're a bike commuter or training for RAGBRAI, there is a lot of activity, economic activity that's being generated as a result of trails and cycling. Next slide. We also went to the trouble of breaking down the GDP of cycling and trails, given that 1.4 billion is a pretty big number. So we took the 50 industries in Iowa and we were able to rank the cycling and trails as a top 50 industry in the state. So this is a market opportunity for economic impact, talent attraction and retention, and quality of life. So that's kind of some of the main messaging, the top line messaging that we use. Next slide. The moniker that we like to use here is World Capital of Trails. That number actually, for a number of total trails, now stands closer to about 2,500 today. And you worked with Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation, which is another statewide partner here that works on trails. And this is that kind of feature story that we're able to talk about as far as, really leaning into the messaging opportunity for outdoor recreation generally that cycling and trails represents. Next slide. Oh, I should have mentioned in the last one, my apologies, that photo was at a ribbon cutting for a great American Rail Trail segment over near the High Trestle Trail. And so that actually went through the very small town of Boughton, Iowa. I think that population there is around 300 folks, but it connected our 2 biggest trail networks, the Raccoon River Valley Trail and the Trestle Trail. And as you can see, people were just so excited to be there. We had over 500 people attend this ribbon cutting, so massive public event. Lots of local government, state government representatives showed up from both the state representatives and state senators. They wanted to be there for this, so we got them to be part of the excitement and got them engaged in celebrating this win. And this is all preceding the legislative session. Next slide. So 900,000 Iowans ride a bike. We broke that down into geographic region and also by usership. By the way, this data was generated through the Census Bureau. We also used CDC data for a health section I'll talk about briefly later, and People for Bikes and other data sources as well. But kind of we use the gold standard of data to produce a lot of this to help reinforce the credibility of the numbers. Next slide. 21,000 jobs are supported by cycling. We really wanted to lean into the jobs, economics, affordability arguments, which we know are hot topics in just about every state right now and across the entire country, but certainly also in Iowa. We have a big brain drain issue here. So when we're thinking about talent attraction, retention, how are we going to keep people here? How are we going to attract them? This is one of the big ways that we can do it. We can lean into this strength. It's an exceptionally positive way and nonpartisan way for people to achieve the economic ends that we all want, regardless of what party you're in. Next slide. So the tourism component here, obviously tourism is really important because it's the first way to introduce your community as a place to live, work, and play to folks coming in, ideally from out of state, but in state as well, that happens too. But this is all out of state, the 13 million being generated here. And people often ask me, well, how much of this is RAGBRAI? Well, RAGBRAI is about 60% out of state, so that would be accounted for here. And we worked very closely with the Iowa Economic Development Authority to get these state-specific numbers. So again, leaning into the credibility factor, they were one of our top sponsors. They chipped in $5,000 to sponsor the study as well. Next slide. Health impacts. So we had a whole section as a way of also adding value. This was part of our original study, and so we wanted to make this also a key component here. And so, a great side benefit, in addition to the economics, are the health impacts that are happening, right? And so we know that these are happening anecdotally. When I go out on the trails, I have improved mental health. I feel more connected to nature and to my community. But what does that look like in a quantifiable way? And so we wanted to, scientifically approach this question. Next slide. This next one here is personally one of my favorites because where this number is coming from, the 49% less likely to have poor mental health, meaning 5,400 fewer Iowans are experiencing poor mental health annually, is coming right out of the U.S. Census Bureau data. And it's literally just two columns of data that we cross-referenced. It was, I believe, the first time that I'm aware of that this had ever been done. But how many days per month do you cycle? And how many days per month do you report having chronic poor mental health? And we cross-referenced those data sets from Census Bureau data. And wouldn't you know it, people who cycle more often have better poor mental health or report less chronic poor mental health days in a month. Next slide. 9,000 fewer Iowans with obesity. There's some other additional numbers here. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and move forward to the next slide. We do go through each of these sections, and this is just a snapshot of the economic impacts of health as well, meaning the cost savings that are occurring in the economy because you don't have to go have a procedure to address these things since you're mitigating that with preventative medicine. And we all know that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, right? That's something that played really well when talking with policymakers, and that cycling and trails is a really cost-effective way to have preventative care. 77% less likely to have colorectal cancer. Cancer is also a really big topic here in our state. We have a state that has one of the highest cancer rates, so we really wanted to highlight this aspect as well. There's a 28% or 27% reduction in breast cancer as well. I can't remember if I had that slide here. Go ahead and advance to the next slide for me. It looks like I omitted that one, but that is part of this study. So you can see the whole health impact section on our website. I believe that was dropped in the chat. Kind of shifting gears to the legislative session that happened starting in January. So all of that work was being done in July and August. Right, so on the timeline, just to kind of center your perspective, we are doing all of that inoculation, getting out ahead of it, as it were, work, and then knowing that this was going to be something where there's an opportunity. Crosswalk protections bill that we got passed was the year prior, but we really wanted to work on hands-free driving, which was our most important thing we were working on, but we also had the priority of preventing any trail funding cuts. So I'm going to go ahead and move to the next slide here. We also wanted to do a county level results for all of our 99 counties so that each county had a way of showcasing and telling their story about the great work that's being done in all of their local trail systems. So really equipping them with their conversation starters with their policymakers about why that trail funding is important to them. So those results are something that I'm really personally proud of because we wanted to make sure that we brought those counties along with us from a local government perspective, because one of the other effective arguments is local control, right? We have a Republican trifecta here in Iowa and a Republican governor. So an argument about local control and how this is, us deciding how we invest in our future at the local level is something that was an argument that resonated. We can go to the next slide. Part of that phase two is we really dialed in at the county level, but we know from that 40% of recreational cyclists ride at least twice per month, and they're generating consistent year-over-year economic impact, job creation, quality of life, and that is true without exception in all 99 counties, and even in the most rural counties, including the most rural county, Appanoose County, which is still having a $500,000 impact every year. Next slide. I think I kind of covered this here. Go ahead and go to the next one. Retails and restaurants, that's one of the industries that's most benefiting from cycling spending as well. And go to the next slide for me, please. Trail funding. So this is kind of the crux of the whole argument that we were trying to set the stage for with this effort with the economic impact study. So when we encountered the legislative session, we'd had a lot of success the prior year. In 2024, in fact, we'd got an extra $1 million for trails in what's called our state recreational trails, the SRT line item, which is administered through the Department of Transportation, the Iowa DOT. And so we were really happy about that, but we knew that that was a one-time influx of spending or funds that were going to be available. So we knew we were going to have to play some defense. But what we didn't know is that a bill was going to be introduced by the same person who gave us the same champion for trails, who gave us that extra $1 billion. Introduced a bill which we had actually registered in support of and had supported the previous session. So we thought there was no issue there. And that would have been all about tourism and creating a marketing fund for tourism. This is something that a lot of states have. And essentially what it would have done is, say, a really, really big event that requires an RFP, like a Taylor Swift concert would be the use case. Having a fund available at the state level to help communities secure those kind of huge economic impact events to come to the state of Iowa. Well, when the fiscal note came out for that particular bill, they were going to essentially rob Peter to pay Paul. They're going to take away money not only from the State Recreational Trails Fund that I mentioned before, but also what's called Destination Iowa. Destination Iowa would be, our state level sort of really big investment fund for big trail infrastructure projects. And it would have cut both of those permanently and taken millions and millions of dollars permanently out of those trail funding programs. And those are something that really are the bread and butter for trail building in Iowa. The way we got to those 2,500 trails was through, in large part, those programs providing big matching funds to the counties working at the local level. And so absent those funding programs, you would really see the new trails that are being built start to dry up because of the lack of state support. And so we knew this was going to be really tricky because we didn't want to burn any bridges with the legislator who introduced the bill. And we had already been on the record, not only registering in in support of the bill, but I showed up to the committee hearing and spoke in favor of it and advocated for it. And that was all before the fiscal note came out. So when our lobbyist reached out to me and said, hey, fun story, we've got an issue here because we registered in support, you spoke in favor, but they're going to do it by cutting all these other things. And trail funding projects are shovel-ready projects. We know they're going to have an economic impact, but a marketing fund, that's speculative at best because we don't know if an RFP is actually going to translate into Taylor Swift coming to town and making a big economic impact. It's a good thing to have, but if you have to trade one for the other, the thing that you'd like to have is the shovel-ready projects, the things that are going to be happening because of these funding programs. So the question was, what do? We don't want to burn the relationship with the legislator who is otherwise, someone who's a champion. I've ridden bikes with this person, and she's a key state senator who has a lot of sway and chairs a committee. So how do we address this issue? And instead of kind of publicly going out and calling it out and doing an action alert and going kind of the grassroots route, which we would typically do in situations like this where we want to activate, our membership and things like that, which I still think is a very viable tactic in most contexts. But was it going to achieve the outcome that we hope, which is preventing these cuts from happening? And so instead of going that route, we decided to explore other more internal ways behind the scenes to have a relationship brought to bear on the other side. So the person who introduced this was a state senator. There was another state representative who administers the same budget, but on the House side, and they have to do a reconciliation, right? A reconciliation between the House and the Senate on funding. And so we worked with that other House rep who is also a champion for trails to make sure that they kept trail funding completely intact in their version of the budget before it reached reconciliation. And so without having any of our fingerprints on the eventual outcome where we prevented a single dollar of trail funding from being cut from any program in the state of Iowa, we had this champion in the House essentially backstop us on this overall effort. And we didn't, animate our user base and get them all up in arms and emailing a state senator who would otherwise be in our corner, burning a relationship in order to win the battle but lose the war, I guess is the metaphor I'll employ here. So that was a success for us, especially given that right now we're facing an $8 billion and counting budget deficit. We know it's going to be an ongoing battle. It's going to be in every single session we have to play defense. Of course, we would love to grow trail funding more, but we are very realistic when it comes to knowing what the political reality is right now. And so we think that holding steady those funding levels for each of these key programs is going to be the priority. So it's going to be our number one policy priority going into the next legislative session. And we just hope that we don't have to necessarily straddle that same very, tricky issue to navigate that. But this was a very big win for us, and we were really proud of it because a lot of that funding does help to go, for example, build those trails like the Great American Rail Trail segment that I highlighted earlier with that photo. There was Destination Iowa money that was brought to bear for that funding source that I mentioned. Next slide. And so one quick offense story as well, and then I'm going to go ahead and wrap and hand it back over to folks. For context here, Iowa's Water and Land Legacy, otherwise known as the Trust Fund or IWIL here, is something that was passed by a will of the voters, a statewide ballot referendum. It's a conservation effort essentially, and we passed that back in 2010. The issue is that it's never been funded because a ballot referendum in the state of Iowa, you can change the Constitution through a ballot referendum, but you cannot increase taxes, is the caveat to that process here. And so it required an act of the legislature to raise the sales tax in order to fund the trust fund, which would have gone essentially to the DNR, the Iowa DNR, in order to help fund trails in a more substantial way, to the tune of millions and millions of dollars, much bigger than any of the other programs we currently have. A lot of other states that I'm aware of, especially in the Midwest, like Minnesota and Missouri, have versions of these trust fund. In fact, I think Minnesota has two different versions of this that are funded in different ways and are also routinely reauthorized. But here in Iowa, we have one that's in the state constitution, was passed by almost a supermajority of the voters back in 2010, and going on almost 17 years later, now it's never been funded. So what do we do with that? The response has been, well, let's go and lean into the county level, going back to the local control argument, and where can we get county level bond referendums on the ballot and passed? And so we worked on two different ballot referendums in Johnston County and in Story County, both of which had Great American Rail Trail segments that we knew were priority targets for getting funding so that we could get segments completed. And I'm very happy to say that, they passed both of them with nearly 80% of the vote. And that's pretty incredible if you think about it, because back when that IWIL was put on the ballot in 2010, it passed with 63% of the vote, which sounds like a lot, but you do have to have 60% plus one because it requires a higher threshold to be passed into the state constitution. And so ballot referendums have a higher bar to reach than just a regular campaign. And so we knew that we had to have a big win here. And Iowa has also, the whole political landscape has changed since 2010. Back in 2010, there was a Democratic trifecta. And now we're on the other side of the partisan spectrum. And even despite that, we saw an increase from that 2010 amount from 63%. But when we look at these county levels, they're reaching 80%. So what has changed? I think it's a combination of things, but the key takeaway here is people support trails, they support outdoor recreation, and when they see in action and in practice how quality of life is improved, how town attraction and retention is improved, how local communities, especially rural communities that don't have a lot to work with in the first place, get a trail in their backyard, and then they see businesses come back to life. Boy, they want more of that, right? And so that's what we're seeing here is an increase of support. Plus, in the background and in the economy, you have the pandemic and a skyrocketing usage of outdoor spaces as well. So I'm really leaning into this local level strategy. You can see it summarized in this yard sign. Vote yes for our land, our water, and our future. That is the message that really resonated. And I know from talking from the Trust for Public Land, who actually spoke with them at their at the summit, the Rails to Trails Summit, they mentioned they supported anywhere from 15 to 50 of these ballot referendums nationally. And for the very first time this last year, they had a 100% success rate with these ballot referendums. So I could nerd out about this all day long. I'll pause myself there and hand it over, but just excited to share this with folks and hopefully you find use for it in your backyard.
Hey, thanks a lot, Luke. That was great. Great to hear. I think there's a lot of lessons to pull from that beyond just the successful legislative defense strategy. And I do want to just highlight what you talked about. There was a lot of what we both called inoculation and building relationships with legislators ahead of time, building like authentic relationships and informing. I think there's a lot of people who don't think about trails, a lot of legislators who never really thought about it and have never made that connection to public health benefits, to economic development benefits, and laying all of that out before your back against the wall with a cut, I think yields a lot better outcomes than if you're only first educating them when there's already the cuts have already been proposed. And if I have time, I'm going to talk a little bit more about those Iowa ballot measures that you brought up, which are a fantastic model. But I want to transition right now to Lily Bostrom. She's a senior environmental planner at Ascent in California. But just for a little context, I mentioned that we're looking at ways to think about funding in different ways, and that's sometimes including going beyond the usual places we look for funding, part of transportation budgets, part of outdoor recreation budgets, and now looking at how do we get biking and walking and trails as part of, let's say, housing affordability packages or transit-oriented development and other ways that are pushing a little bit beyond the usual ways we do this. And the other piece of this is that there's a lot of times a lot of well-meaning regulatory policies around the country that have sometimes been weaponized in a way that prevents the development of things like trails, biking, and walking. And I think many of us have encountered situations where it takes 4 years of environmental review to build a bike lane, even when logically a bike lane or a trail should be pretty obviously an environmentally friendly situation. And I think that this is part of a broader growing movement, and some people on here might not agree with it. Some of it was discussed in that book, Abundance by Ezra Klein, and I forget the other author's name. But we're seeing that some bipartisan support for looking at some regulatory policies that might have been abused or have been weaponized against being able to build biking and walking infrastructure in ways that we might be able to modify those in a way to facilitate the creation of biking, walking, and trail infrastructure. So Lily is going to give a case study from California that I think gets at a lot of these issues. Lily?
Great. Thanks for that introduction, Drew, and great presentation, Luke, and awesome work in Iowa in maintaining trail funding. So my name is Lily Bostrom. I'm a senior environmental planner and project manager at Ascent Environmental, which is an environmental consulting firm in California. I primarily manage the preparation of environmental documents under the California Environmental Quality Act for parks, trails, and open space, as well as wildfire resilience projects here in California. So today I'll be talking about California Senate Bill 131 and its role in advancing park and trail projects in California. Next slide, please. So here's an agenda for my presentation today. I'll be giving a brief overview of what the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, is, for those of you that aren't familiar with it. I'll provide a recent history of CEQA streamlining attempts for parks and trails. I'll talk about Senate Bill 131 as it relates to advancing the development of parks and trails, including what makes it different, what projects qualify for its benefits, and how to use it. And I'll close with an overview of the legislative backdrop leading up to this bill and an outlook for the new CEQA exemptions that came with the bill. Next slide, please. So the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, is essentially the California version of the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, and it applies to all discretionary projects proposed or approved by a public agency in California. So it requires public agencies to evaluate and disclose the potential environmental impacts of their projects and to avoid or reduce significant impacts using mitigation when feasible. So varying levels of environmental review and documentation are needed based on the severity of impacts of a proposed project, and all require some level of public review and consideration of public comments. So as you can imagine, the type of environmental document that needs to be prepared influences the overall project cost and schedule. And on average, a CEQA document can take anywhere from 9 months to a year and a half to even 2 years to prepare. So even though public park and trail projects often have a lot of bipartisan and public support, they are often in natural environments where sensitive biological or cultural resources may be present, and full CEQA review is typically required. So next slide, please. So in September 2024, California Governor Newsom signed Assembly Bill 2091, creating a new CEQA exemption for non-motorized public access to existing roads, trails, and similar areas owned by a park district or the Great Redwood Trail Agency. So to use this exemption, the lead agency needed to hold a public meeting to solicit input and consider the project's effects on natural and tribal cultural resources, make required findings, and then file a notice of exemption. So to qualify, the access could not require or result in a physical alteration to the environment, such as constructing a new trail or trailhead, and it would need to be not likely to result in a significant impact to cultural resources or special status species. So given these requirements and that the exemption is limited to park districts and the Great Redwood Trail Agency specifically, it didn't really achieve broad applicability or usefulness in advancing active transportation and public access. Next slide, please. So fast forward to June of this year, and we have Senate Bill 131. This is a California budget trailer bill that, along with AB 130, marks the most significant overhaul of California's housing and environmental review laws that we've seen in decades. So importantly, Senate Bill 131 included a broad new statutory CEQA exemption for public parks and non-motorized recreation trail projects funded in whole or in part by the Safe Drinking Water, Wildfire Prevention, Drought Preparedness, and Clean Air Bond Act of 2024. I know it's a mouthful. It's also known as Proposition 4. So the language from the bill related to parks and trails is shown on this slide, and it really is just to emphasize how broad and sweeping this exemption is for parks and trails funded by Prop 4. So what's really unique about this exemption is that it does not identify specific environmental eligibility requirements or exceptions for unusual circumstances that come with most exemptions that currently exist. So this provides great flexibility in its application to projects. It's also very broad, and it covers the full range of public parks and trails activities, from acquisition to planning and design through to construction, operations, and maintenance. And in terms of its practical use, to use it, all an agency has to do is file a notice of exemption with the state clearinghouse in California, and if it's a local lead agency, with the county clerk's office as well. A discretionary best practice we often recommend is to prepare a brief memo to file explaining why the lead agency determined that the project qualifies for the exemption. Next slide, please. So getting back to innovative state legislative approaches, which is the focus of the webinar today, in California, there has been trending support for streamlining the environmental review and permitting process for environmentally beneficial projects and funding. And this includes things like vegetation management with Senate Bill 901 and for restoration projects with the restoration management permit legislation and the statutory exemption for restoration projects or SERP. So the California Natural Resources Agency and the governor's office have worked with the legislature over the last few years to support this streamlining. And in this case, it was achieved for beneficial public access projects in California. So Senate Bill 131 is a continuation of the state's policy efforts to make it easier and faster to approve beneficial projects and help leverage funds previously spent on complex environmental reviews to rather be spent implementing restoration, vegetation treatment, and now public park and trails projects. So as a legislative strategy, special perhaps to California, budget trailer bills are needed and being used to make policy changes necessary to implement the budget. So budget trailer bills can be quickly conceived, reviewed, and passed on simple majority votes as part of the annual state budget process. And they also take effect immediately upon being signed by the governor. So there are some constituents that are concerned that the trailer bills don't provide enough public process and review of bills. But as long as the legislature is supportive, the trailer bills can be effective and fast. And this type of state level support of streamlining environmental review and permitting processes for beneficial projects, such as trails, can transcend partisan politics, and hopefully similar streamlining mechanisms could be achieved elsewhere. Regarding Senate Bill 131, it was a really big trailer bill package that included exemptions for many other project types related to the housing crisis here in California. And there has been some opposition to pieces of it related to streamlining of industrial development, as well as the overall lack of requirements around environmental and cultural considerations. So we could see some changes in the future, but as it stands now, it's a very broad and useful exemption for public park and non-motorized trail projects in California that are receiving Prop 4 funding that I expect will increase the development of these types of projects. In August, myself and a few colleagues wrote a detailed piece on this CEQA exemption for parks and trails funded by Prop 4. We'll drop a link in the chat if you're interested in reading more about it and how to apply it to your project. And for those of you interested specifically in Prop 4 funding, Prop 4 includes a total of $700 million for a variety of activities related to supporting park creation and outdoor access activities. And the LAO recently released the year 2025-2026 California spending plan for Prop 4, which indicates that the budget appropriates about 2/3 of the $700 million in year 25 to 26. Which I think we already did drop a link in the chat to the spending plan for those interested in learning more. Next slide. That's all I have for you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Lily. Appreciate that. Thanks for laying that out. And like I said, I think this kind of thing is part of a movement that we're going to see more of in states around the country. So really quick, I want to allow enough time for Q&A. I know we have a number of questions in the hopper. I just wanted to mention, I mean, as I do every year at this, there's different funding models. Not everything's going to work everywhere. And we are trying to think around, what are some different ways to move the ball forward that don't involve the usual path of new funding. One is, rather than statewide, you could pursue specific trail funding and earmarks. It depends on states. And if you have questions about how these work, feel free to reach out to me directly because every state's different. Some allow earmarks more directly, some don't. Lily mentioned the Great Redwood Trail in Northern California, and that was one that was the beneficiary of some more specific trail funding. I think it created a whole program or agency to administer this very long trail. Some years back, we worked with state-based partners to advocate for the Empire State Trail, which I think was $200 million to complete a 750-mile cross state, very big destination trail. And the Mopac Trail in Nebraska, which is I believe, part of the Great American Rail Trail, that was in their overall budget and kind of passed as a line item to support that trail. Some other things really quick. I don't have it on here, but one thing we are working on, we're working right now with Virginia and New Jersey, the two states that had odd numbered year gubernatorial elections and have new governors taking office in, I think, January, is to reach out to them with some criteria and recommendations around the appointment of their secretaries of their State Department of Transportation and the equivalent of the State Department of Natural Resources. Sometimes it's Parks and Wildlife, sometimes it's environmental protection. They have different names, but the more outdoor rec type agency in the state, and to have some influence and help in some guidance to the incoming administrations around those so that you get real advocates for biking, walking, and trails in those positions. Statewide trail planning can always, I think, help, especially in a tight environment too. I think even fiscal conservatives like to see it because they see that things are well planned and you can often point to projects in the pipeline that are in their district where that would benefit them immediately, if there's more funding. There's also ways to do, even without new funding, consolidating some funding sources. California has a shining model called the Active Transportation Program that putting all of the different funding sources so you don't have to apply for them all separately, and so that you don't have small, tiny programs that don't actually yield that much money. It's all under one umbrella. And we modeled that in Minnesota as well. It didn't cost any money to create the program, but it facilitates more funding and it facilitates drawing down the funding. So that's one thing you could look at. And then there is some tax credits for trail easements. A state like South Carolina, a very Republican state, passed that, I think, last year. Finally, Luke, ballot initiatives we see as a big path forward. I think it's going to be a tough environment with legislatures and appropriations going forward. Ballot initiatives, and I think Luke kind of alluded to this, have been quite popular. We had one last year, a big one in Columbus, the county that includes Columbus, Ohio, primarily a transit one, but I think about a quarter of it, in a substantial number of millions of dollars, was for active transportation. And so if you get involved early with, let's say, a transit-focused initiative, getting them to include biking, walking, and trails in it can be a way to, circumvent any legislative friction and go straight to the voters. And I do point out that I think Luke mentioned that Trust for Public Land tracked a lot of ballot initiatives in 2024, and they passed something like 100% of the time. And so I do think trails tend to be popular, and I see them as a sweetener. You have a lot of people who, I'm a big transit user, but a lot of people are not. And you're asking the population, most of whom probably don't use public transit, to often support funding. Trails can broaden the support base for that because you might have people who use trails or use biking and walking, but don't use transit. And so it can be a sweetener to build political support. Luke talked about the Iowa model, but it's really a model that we're pushing around the country. And you have to look at your state and how much they allow ballot initiatives, whether it's statewide or local level. But, the ones that Luke cited, those were substantial amounts of money for not huge population counties, 25 and 30 million each. And it was a good case where the state, like Luke said, the state had failed over and over and over again to fund this state program that the voters had indicated they wanted. So these two counties just went off on their own and did it. And so we are looking for cases where you might be in a state where you just don't feel it's viable to get new funding at the state level, if it's allowable, pursuing this model of going out and doing it on your own at the county or municipal level might be a new path forward. I don't have enough time to really get into the nitty-gritty of how to start a ballot initiative, but if you are interested in that, reach out to me and we can figure out what the process would be in your state, what opportunities there might be, maybe other campaigns that you can join forces with. And just to wrap up, I'm always interested to know what people are working on. If we can help them, we can amplify a lot of your message using our membership and our grassroots base, help you with some policy models. So reach out to me, please. I love to hear what people are doing for legislative session, but also if you have questions or want more specifics than we have time to get into here. So with that, I'll kick it back to Iman to queue up Q&A.
Yeah. Thank you to our presenters for sharing with us today. And we'll now have opportunity for audience Q&A, and I encourage you all to continue to submit your questions as we begin this portion of the session. And I'll also mention that some of the questions are being directly answered by our panelists in the Q&A box. So our first question is, trails are powerful infrastructure for a variety of users, including walkers, runners, and cyclists. What tips do you have for ensuring that all users feel included in the advocacy and we think about positive impacts holistically? To any of our panelists who want to jump in to answer this question.
Sorry, just switching gears back here after answering some questions directly in the chat. Can you repeat the question?
How can we ensure that all users of trails, including bikers and walkers, maybe bird watchers, picnickers, feel included in the advocacy and we think about all of these benefits holistically?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll just kick it off here if that's okay. This is something that I'm personally passionate about. My fiance Alicia actually works for the Audubon Society, and so I am cognizant of the bird watching element for sure as well. And I think anytime we can make a trail more multi-purpose, I think it brings just more vibrancy to the community. In my experience personally, I'll take for example the Heart of Iowa Nature Trail as the most recent example of a trail that we got fully completed over in Story County, Iowa, which is one of those counties that passed that ballot referendum. And so it was, marketed and themed around being the Heart of Iowa Nature Trail. And it even went through a nature preserve. And so there were elements of the trail that were very nature oriented, and things along the trail that were done to make it just more integrated with nature. So for example, instead of just a straight shot, some concrete laid down, which would have been more cost efficient, they had it meander through nature so that you had as the user experience, whether you were walking, hiking, biking, or however you were using the trail, you had the experience of feeling more connected with nature. And that was really by design from the purpose of how they envisioned the trail. And so I think that's a really great example in my mind of how it can really be done right. And then they had really great displays that were put up talking about the natural elements that are along the trail that you could stop and either scan a QR code or do some reading about some of the, wildlife that's in the area, whether that be birds or otherwise, and how we can do more to protect the prairie and things like that. So that was a cool example that came to mind.
I'd say thinking of just mentioning different users whenever you're messaging this, not assuming it's just cyclists. Saying walking, biking, and rolling is a good way because rolling encompasses other types of, like, it could be skateboarding or scooters or pushing a stroller, and it could also be people who use wheelchairs. So I think it's a more inclusive thing. There are cases, I'm not going to say where, but sometimes we lead with walking first because sometimes there's bike lash and some negative feelings in certain communities about biking. So we'll often point out, we'll say walking and biking trails to kind of put the emphasis on the walking part. And then also in terms of the accessibility, make sure that if you are doing events, that they are accessible to people who use wheelchairs, and includes lobby days and things like that.
Great. Another question we have is about all the webinars that are happening this week. There's a strong emphasis on the importance of building relationships with our elected officials in advance of funding needs. What have the panelists initiated? How have the panelists initiated this in their communities? Building relationships prior to delivering a funding ask.
Lily, you want to kick this one off first and then I can go after that?
Well, I was going to say, I think this one might be for you, Luke. I don't really do much advocacy in my work.
So in my experience, and Drew kind of alluded to this point, so I'll make it an even more pointed way. I think you want to build that relationship before you need it, right? Because if the time period where you are in front of that legislator is during session when they have 20 other bills and 50 other stakeholders that are asking them for something, the likelihood of them listening to you is pretty finite. And that's just because of the volume of work that our local legislators are tasked with, right? They have a lot on their plate. And so finding opportunities to engage with them when you have no asks at all to make of them and just genuinely building a relationship. They're humans too. So for example, that same legislator that I was alluding to earlier, who got us an extra million for trail funding and then the following session introduced legislation to cut trail funding. I've done their bike ride where they do a fundraiser for their campaign. And so I just went and participated in the bike ride, and had a couple of beers afterwards, and, a different of our pack delivered a check to them, right? So a separate entity. I didn't personally give a donation, but, I participated and showed face and built that relationship. And then I showed up to other bills that they introduced that still had relevance to us. So I think during the session, when you show up for things that are not necessarily your priority bills, that helps build relationships as well and builds trust because they see that, you're not just in it for your own very narrow scope of what you think is important, but also because you want to see your state, your community succeed. Right. And so if we all are working together to make, in my case, Iowa, the best place it can be to live, work, and play, and I show up for a bill that isn't necessarily about cycling, but maybe it's about how we can make the state better in other ways. And that's a bill that they're working on. They're gonna take notice of that.
Yeah, that's a great reminder about, that coalition work. It's not always going to be your exact issue, but you gotta, you know, show support for other ones so they'll support you on your issue. Yeah, I think invite elected officials to, if you have trail events or anything, invite them to things. Even if they don't come, they know about it, they're more aware of it. Like Luke said, educate them about your issue, your project, whether it's a project, whether it's trails in general or active transportation and all the various benefits when you're not asking them for a vote. Thank them also afterwards. They get a lot of they take a lot of slings and arrows, but they often don't get thanked for voting the right way or pushing something. And I think just this is more for citizen activists, is just to not be afraid of legislators. Like Luke said, they are humans. And I think state legislators, they represent a smaller district than members of Congress in almost all cases. So they're usually more approachable. And they also, and don't sleep on staff. Now, every state's different. Some states have like one admin for the whole legislative office. And then others have a lot of very specific, like issue by issue staff. It really varies wildly by state. So kind of understand that dynamic. I think if it's a low staffed one, you might want to back off a little bit more. If it's a state with a large professionalized staff, I think then you can more regularly engage with their, transportation or recreation policy person to keep them informed.
Okay, and our final question comes from Indiana, where a change in the governor's mansion has resulted in a significant loss of funding for the Next Level Trails program. What recommendation do the panelists have for trying to understand the intentions when changes like this happen? What advice do you have for activating our local leaders to apply pressure on state and federal leaders on the behalf of our communities? It was really
Yeah, I think I actually heard about this from folks who worked or have worked in Indiana when I came to the Trail Nation Summit. I think I spoke to someone about this directly. And so I think I'm generally aware of that shift because there was a lot of funding that was available in the previous administration. And now that's been just dramatically, if not draconianly, cut to a very small amount. So that's an incredibly, my heart goes out to anyone dealing with that situation. That is incredibly difficult because there's a lot of moving pieces to that, I understand. But when it comes to activating folks, I think going back to the economic impact study and the model that we applied as far as stakeholder engagement, that's why that work is so important, because activating the whole ecosystem, right? It's not just about the trail-friendly businesses. It's also about every single other type of constituency. So doing that constituency mapping, doing the hard work to engage them in the process of building out the story that you want to tell for the value that trails bring, so that every single constituency has their version of the story to tell. So if it's local bike shops, here's what the 80 local bike shops are doing, in our case in Iowa, to generate, small business revenue in the economy in Iowa. Or if it's trail associations, here's how all these volunteer-led boards who are your friends groups and all those things, here's the part they can play. Or if they are local elected leaders who are champions and in your corner and they don't want to see this happen, you've engaged them, you've invited them to ribbon cutting. You have to find a hook for each one of those constituencies, and what's the hook for that one? And you're doing that work well before hopefully you've encountered that issue. And if you have a lot of funding to work with, just make sure that folks are seeing the wins and like I said, inviting them to the ribbon cutting, making sure that they're thanked, like Drew was talking about. That's going to be really, really key, because, just getting them to sign the bill and then never hearing back from you after that isn't going to be, making them want to work with you again in the future to get something done, because they put a lot of effort into it, making it happen.
I'll just say that, next year is midterm years tend to be when more gubernatorial elections occur. So you're going to have a lot of gubernatorial elections next year. And then from that, a lot of new governors taking office at the beginning of 2027. So Indiana is a good case where the previous governor was a big champion and the new one's not. So you could use the campaign as a time to try to elevate the issue, make it a campaign issue, or try to meet with both candidates or multiple primary candidates. Again, a lot of them maybe have never considered that trails have economic benefits, or they think of them solely as a leisure sort of thing, and not that people use them as a safe way to get to school and to work and their kids to school and things like that. So getting out, and then once you have an election like we're doing in New Jersey and Virginia right now, trying to reach out to the governor-elect, their transition staff, their policy staff, so that maybe they're aware of these issues and before draconian cuts like we saw in Indiana take place.
Yeah, just to quickly build on that, because I think that's incredibly smart. And just in terms of the approach and operational way to deal with that, I think what we do is we have a running list of all of the coffee and conversations, the local, super local community meetings. If you can find a way to track that in a spreadsheet and then use it as a volunteer engagement and volunteer building opportunity. The campaign schedule for a gubernatorial race is often forecast in advance, right? And so you could map out, if they're doing a county by county tour, when are they going to be in each of these counties, getting that into a spreadsheet, and then you saying, hey, volunteers who appreciate this trail in this community, we need you to show up and say that at this meeting to this candidate.
Great. So with that, I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and special thank you to Luke and Lily and Drew for sharing your insights and expertise. Contact information for our panelists will be found on the next screen. And email addresses and links to our organizations are also dropped in the chat. And I just want to mention before we go some RTC resources and upcoming webinars in December. We'll also drop these to the chat, but our first will be on December 4th, which will cover the state of play for federal grant decisions through programs like RAISE and Reconnecting Communities. And then on December 10th, we'll be covering statewide planning for trails and active transportation. More information and links to register for these webinars are in the chat. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and have a wonderful day and great rest of your week. Thank you, Luke and Lily, so much.